Thank you for joining us. My name is Muhammad Arju, and I will be hosting you today on behalf of Society for Conservation Biology's Marine Section. And one of the reasons we wanted to, at SCB Marine, wanted to host this webinar is that we were having all this kind of new momentum in discussing fisheries and aquatic conservation, particularly marine conservation, is last couple of months. So we thought this is one of the top and kind of contentious issue in ocean conservation, ocean governance, distance social fishing. So we approached one of the top researchers about this topic, Dr. DYHIA BELHABIB. And of course, we today want to have really sincere discussions, and we will welcoming any questions from you. All you have to do to ask questions, just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And if you have like points to make or comments or just want to introduce yourself, you can use the chat box. But again, to ask question, use the Q&A box. With that, I'm going to hand over SCB Marine's past president and Oceana's chief scientist, Dr. KATHRYN Matthewes. Over to you, Katie.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us from whatever time zone you are you are calling in from. Thank you so much to Arju for organizing these. This has taken a lot of time and cat herding, we call it, getting people together to have an important conversation. The topic of distant water fishing is something that we have been thinking about, certainly at Oceana, marine conservationists in general, looking at the conversations that have happened at international marine conservation congresses, the international meetings that SCB Marine runs. There are many perspectives. The conversation for a long time has been dominated by those countries and fleets that have been dominating distant water fishing, which I think really begs the question, where are the voices that haven't been participating in this conversation? And so I'm excited to hear a little bit more from those sectors and people with different experiences. So DYHIA is going to be our first speaker. Dr. BELHABIB, I have been an admirer of hers for a very long time. And recently I've been able to work with her directly. And I am absolutely thrilled that she is our, I guess, keynote speaker for this webinar. So Dr. BELHABIB, welcome. Take it away, I guess.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna share my screen for the presentation. It's gonna take a second. Hopefully you can see this little kid walking on the beach at a landing site in Senegal. Can you see this? Great. So thank you, Katie. Thank you, Arju. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here today. I am calling in from Vancouver in Canada. I have not been out of Canada for a while, so I really miss these kind of images. I really miss being there and taking these kind of pictures. I usually start my presentations with headlines. I love, you know, sexy and glamorous headlines that are just shocking, like a good reporter, which I'm not. But this time I really wanted to start with an actual quote for a fisherman that I heard for the very first time when I was still in Algeria and was hearing a lot over and over and over again throughout wherever I went. So they took all the fish away is something that I heard the first time in 2007. And that kind of shifted the way that I was thinking about fish, not anymore like, you know, fishermen are evil, but more like fishermen are part of the ecosystem now. And I've been hearing that in Guinea, in Senegal, basically even in Norway, you know. This is, and here, even in Canada as well. So it is something that unfortunately happens and occurs over and over again. And as I'm going through this presentation, I want you to just keep in mind this little child here that is taking fish that looks sad, but he was actually just confused. He was very happy right before I took this picture. Again, doing the job of a good reporter is taking things sometimes out of context, but this is the context. He was very happy to chase those guys that were transporting fish on their heads. And whenever there was a fish falling on the floor, he would just take it and bring it to his mom. So he was actively looking. So his mom could actually process that fish. Nothing is wasted. And as I talk and I speak throughout this presentation, I want you to be in the shoes, no pun intended here, of this little child. I was that little child once. I was never chasing fish, but I was walking barefoot. I was very happy. You don't wear shoes when you're on the beach. So this perception that small scale fisheries people are like poor and in need is yet another stereotype that we're going to go through this presentation, hopefully debunk. But just keep in mind this child, like imagine yourself being this child as I'm presenting here. There was a documentary recently that argued, and I think most of us would have watched it, that we should stop eating fish to be able to save the oceans. Simplified conclusion. We can't stop eating fish. The reason behind that is that there are 3.2 billion people on the planet that rely on fish for their livelihood, for their, protein intake. And the fact is that our ancestors, human species has fished for thousands of years. This is not new. And the ocean has not necessarily collapsed because of that. What changed is industrialization since the 1950s, and that has kind of shifted the way that we look into fishing and fisheries in general. Fisheries generate a lot of employment as well, and half of that in some regions is actually female. So it's a very gender, I would say, balanced sector. Even though we don't see a lot of women on boats, we see a lot of women in the processing sector. And that's rather important, because if we stop fishing, then we actually are creating a lot of discohesion, if you will, in these coastal communities. Something that really struck me and struck a nerve, especially after that documentary came out, was that this power and wealth imbalance between between David and Goliath, as I call that. So you have, from one hand, a small scale sector that is, whether unmotorized or motorized, but under 24 meters in length, that is basically coastal, that represents 99% of the entire world fleet, those 4.6 million vessels globally, but catches only less than a quarter, of the total catches. Versus you have that 1%, it's like really the Wall Street dogma that we heard a few years ago, 1% that is catching, which is big vessels like big trawlers, purse seiners, etc., that are catching 75% of that wealth. There is a huge power imbalance there, which is accentuated when you see these vessels are actually operating sometimes within the same spaces, geographically, within the same time, or catching the same species. The small scale sector, as I mentioned, is a major contributor to food security, although it only takes 25% of the fish in the water. Catches are predominantly destined, and this is a stereotype, I would say, but it's something that is based on overwhelming majority. Catches are predominantly destined to local markets or regional markets. There are sometimes some exports, but that is not a rule. The rule is that those catches remain within the area where they were caught. If you go to Senegal, you're going to see these huge trucks that transport fish towards Niger and Mali and these landlocked countries that need fish, as a protein, because they don't have much else. In some regions, you'll find that fish constitutes over 85% of the annual protein intake of the people. I heard fishermen in the Cook Islands telling me that they either have fish to eat or chicken feet, not chicken legs or chicken thighs, chicken feet. I'm using my words here, and they were really threatened by the European fleet, the purse seine fleet that was going in, that was negotiating an agreement with the local government to fish tuna. They went to court and they lost. But the fishermen were telling me, we don't want to eat chicken feet anymore. We want our fish back. The other thing about the small scale sector, and I know this is like talking a lot about small scale sector, for context reasons, it really matters. For that little boy on the beach, this really matters. It's a sector that allows for resilience. So whenever there's an armed conflict, whenever there's a disaster, for example, we have done some research and published a paper on this in 2019. We found that the small scale sector increased its catches after a conflict, an armed conflict or a major disaster, an earthquake, a tsunami. Even if everything is destroyed, people are still going to fish and use the ocean as a bank for their survival, for their food, for their money and income, etc. And it's something that is very natural. So if we lose that bank, if we take away the wealth from that bank, it's going to be really gloomy. On the other side, you have, I believe it's Goliath who is the big one, right? Not David is the small one. Anyways, you have the industrial sector. So the sector takes away 10 million tons of fish a year. This is a lot. It's 75% of the entire catch. It's predominantly destined for export markets. So even when it's caught, especially by a distant water fishing fleet, by a boat that is, let's say, flagged to Spain and goes towards Spain, it's considered to be an export because it's taken from somewhere else. Big boats are not going to fish within coastal waters, not typically. Vessels are mainly of foreign origin, and this is the distant water fishing fleet that we're talking about, and operate under various forms of agreements and joint ventures, and sometimes that access is not even warranted or granted. And this is the kind of work that we have done recently with Oceana, looking into these various types of, undercover, I would say going undercover for the distant water fishing fleet. We hear a lot of fishermen saying this, they took away the fish from us, and they see these boats going back and forth, fishing right in front of them, and sometimes running towards them or to them. So it comes in various shapes and colors. So we have vessels that are going to be typically flagged to a foreign nation. So whether that foreign nation is where the beneficial owner is, or it's somewhere else to hide some shady tax, dealings like Belize and Panama, etc. And then I'm avoiding to mention the Seychelles for now, because we have a panelist from the Seychelles, but it's also a place that is known as a flag of convenience state. We have vessels that are gonna go from, let's say, Spain or China towards another country, a coastal state, and take the flag of that state. And when that happens, it's domesticated. Sometimes they will go a long way to hide their beneficial ownership, but sometimes it's quite direct. Owner is in country A, flag is in country B where the vessel is fishing. That's also very typical. Another way is when you have fleets from neighboring countries that go and fish within the state that is neighboring them. So Guinea-Bissau fishing in Senegal, for example, or vice versa, is very typical as well. And that's also considered to be distant water fishing because it goes towards another country's waters. But something that is really, we need to be cautious there is that sometimes they're adjacent and domesticated, meaning that that vessel from Guinea-Bissau isn't really from Guinea-Bissau, but it adds an extra layer of complexity to the issue where you don't know where the vessel owner is from. You don't know really where the vessel is from, but you do know that there's an agreement between two countries. And sometimes there isn't even an agreement between these countries, and the vessel just uses one country as an adjacent platform to go to the other to fish illegally. The sad truth is that we don't know much about the operations, the corporate networks of these fleets, and they remain very problematic. There are a lot of studies that looked into the number of vessels, fishing hotspots where they are located, fishing tracks. Global Fishing Watch does a lot of work on that as well, illegal fishing and reflagging practices. But even with these, there are a lot of disputes, for example, with regards to the impacts of reflagging, depending on what sort of information you're going to use. And the information which overall is not really there. So if we zoom into examples, because globally it's not really easy to do this, I'm zooming into Africa because it's a region of the world that I really like, but also because we have done some work with Oceana very recently on this. We looked into all the vessels that were licensed to fish in the region. We found that there were nearly 900 vessels licensed there, of which 162 had multiple licenses across various countries in the region. And 197, so nearly 200, were actually domesticated within the region. So they came from somewhere else, but they acquired the flag of the nations where they were fishing in. But something that was really interesting that we found was that nearly 300 vessels of those 862 were found with a criminal record. That's basically a third of the vessels that were found with a criminal record, and most of them have committed offenses at least twice. So being there for this third was actually a way to have a platform to fish illegally. They were adjacent. It provides them with the opportunity to fish illegally within the neighboring countries, or even within the very country where they're licensed to fish in. When we look into their operations, whether legally or illegally, basically in general, we analyzed with Global Fishing Watch 4.2 million fishing hours in the region. And I know these graphs look a bit complicated for some, but to be honest, it's very simple. Most of those dots are between 0 to 24 nautical miles of the coast. And that's exactly where the small scale sector is operating mostly. So it's basically, there's a lot of overlap between the operations of the industrial fleet or distant water fishing fleet in this case, and the small scale sector in this particular region. And that creates a lot of problems, because when you're overlapping in terms of region, you're also overlapping in terms of the species that you're actually catching. You're also creating opportunities. I would say this is a bad term for this, but opportunities for accident occurrence. 250 people die in the region in collisions with industrial vessels, most of which are going to be happening within that 0 to 24 nautical miles, and most of which are collisions with distant water fishing fleet vessels. This creates this social discohesion, if you will, and a sense of distrust in local governance mechanisms. When you see these boats, going and going out, and there is this kind of, feeling of powerlessness, if you will, but also distrust in your local government that they're not doing much to address that. It increases poverty as well, as these big boats take away catch opportunities from the small guys, but also a sense of maritime insecurity, not only because people are dying, but there is a sense of rebellion that is growing, and it leads to issues of like, I was going to say insurgency. It leads to issues of piracy, basically, and armed robbery at sea. And it's a symptom. That piracy is a symptom of bigger issues, and these issues could be linked directly to illegal fishing in some cases. In terms of the impacts of this on the small scale sector as well, and this is really important, we have seen in the case of Senegal a direct impact in that the catches in Senegal of the small scale sector have been declining. But interestingly, as they were competing against the big Russian pelagic trawlers, many of the Senegalese boats have grown in size over time, like the Senegalese small scale boats, and they were reaching newer grounds like Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Guinea, and even Angola actually, to seek fish, Sierra Leone, etc. And what this translates into is what we call the spillover effect. So it's basically when there's just too many people, too many boats fishing within the waters of a country, and then some of them decide to go somewhere else to fish because catch opportunities are not that great within their own waters. We see the spillover effect in Europe as well, but the problem in Europe is that the spillover effect concerns the distant water fishing fleet. Those big boats that are coming from Europe to somewhere else to fish, including West Africa, the Cook Islands, Western Indian Ocean, etc. When the distant water fishing fleet operates illegally, there are obviously really negative impacts on the coastal communities, loss of jobs, increased poverty, declining fish stocks. But also something that we noticed is that it was undermining compliance as well by the small scale sector. Remember, discohesion. People are more willing to engage in illegal fishing when they see everybody else is doing it, but also when they don't have really a choice. They're going to use dynamite, they're going to engage in drug trafficking, for example, and they're going to engage in other types of illegality because they don't necessarily always have an alternative. We're talking in terms of practices of the distant water fishing fleet about human rights and labor abuse as well. We see that a lot nowadays. We know that we don't really have good numbers for the fishing sector, but overall 21 million are enslaved in various sectors globally. In some cases, like in Thailand, we found that 40% of the total labor in this sector were actually trafficked people. And it is a global issue. It is not only in Southeast Asia or in West Africa where it happens in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, in Australia even. So it's something that we see a lot, and it's something that is hard to monitor because of the nature of the operations of distant water fishing fleets. There's also a problem of narco trade that is increasing nowadays, but it's not necessarily linking directly to the distant water fishing fleet, but rather the impacts of their activities within coastal states. Whether we call it exclusionary conservation, like big MPAs being created without the consulting with the local communities, or fish opportunities declining, the result is the same. People are going to engage more and more in illicit trade, including in drug trafficking. 60% of all interdictions globally of drug trafficking are by small-scale fishermen that are now we call drug mules or sea mules, basically. And this is really bad because they're not inherently criminals, but people that have been, pushed by some kind of context towards doing that at sea. In a conversation that I had, I wouldn't say recently, I would say 2 years ago at WTO, I presented about a special differential treatment with regards to how subsidies should be addressing, the issue of overexploitation and illegal fishing. And I said that the small scale sector should be treated differently. And it's built in without the disciplines, basically. You know, this special differential treatment is a consideration of the World Trade Organization. I remember when I said this, I gave the example of Senegal and West Africa because that's what I was looking into. And there was a delegate from the EU that said we cannot start making exceptions. And I think that I was really angry then. I really reacted emotionally, but it was warranted because I told him, well, maybe you should start, you know, excluding your fleets first. Then we will not have to do this, you know, this exceptional measures of, you know, considering that the small scale sector should still have access to subsidies. The idea is that if we take them away, if we take away Goliath, I believe it's Goliath, the big guy, someone would correct me anyways, but if we take away the distance of that 1% or maybe 0.5, you know, 0.5% of this effort, of this big effort, I think that many coastal communities around the planet wouldn't even need subsidies anymore to make a decent living. The key is that in the decent living, it makes sense. It just makes sense to get rid of at least a fraction of the decent water fishing fleet. Now, I'm not stereotyping all big vessels as being bad. There are some that are making really a lot of progress in terms of sustainability, some that are going to be necessary for some states that are not basically able to fish with small scale sectors, some that are being you know, needed in terms of like feeding millions around the planet. But overall, just think of a way that 75% could be recaptured for coastal communities, and, you know, rethinking the system in such a way that we don't, you know, deplete our waters with this big non-selective, for example, pelagic trawlers or trawlers in general that we're looking into. So the idea here is one of common sense, as Arju mentioned earlier. It is one of common sense. And when we see the implications of decent water fishing fleets, you know, sustainability is threatened and conservation as well. Maritime safety is threatened. There is environmental defender retaliation that is happening, and that could lead to, you know, piracy and other security issues, but also the social and economic well-being and cohesion of these coastal communities. And overall, avoiding this message of stop eating fish by portraying everybody that 99% as a bad guy. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dia. I think it's my job now to do some moderating. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And DYHIA, yes, it is Goliath. I know you were worried. David's the little one. Goliath is the big one. So thank you so much for that. And I want to give an opportunity for our panelists to perhaps give their sort of first reaction to what they've heard from Dr. Belhabib and on the topic in general, while we wait for questions from the audience to come in. So maybe we'll start with Sheena.
Sure. Thank you so much for that presentation. Really enlightening, and as always, a pleasure to listen to. Yeah, and I think you hit some really great points there. If anyone joined in yesterday, we were talking about parachute science and how that affects conservation, essentially, and science in general. And I think it's very similar in this case, right? Where especially me, I'm from a large ocean state. So I'm from the Seychelles, and decent water fishing is very prevalent within our waters. And it definitely is something that a lot of the youth here are keeping an eye on and looking at. And I think one of the big things, and you mentioned this, is the lack of transparency within these fishing industries. A lot of the time, we don't even know the extent of the damage that is being caused. So I think that's one of the points that I really took away from it, and having conversations with people from the Seychelles, especially working within these fishing industries, you know, that's one of the things that is mentioned a lot. What is the transparency? What is actually going on? Yeah, so on that note, I think I'll pass on to Hussein.
Thank you, Dr. Dare, for the excellent presentation. I agree with Daya on the points, especially with the points raised on coastal states. and the dependencies as well, and how it affects and how they are connected to resilience. For example, in the Maldives, for the past year with the pandemic, the only revenue source, the whole economy was from fisheries. So the whole economy stopped except fishing. Imagine a whole economy getting on the only source of revenue for the whole economy is fishing. So we just can't. It's not a matter of stopping fisheries at all. We need to find ways and to make it more sustainable and to continue with fishing, because it's really a matter of life and death for most of the coastal states. And I might not be the best person to talk about distant water fishing nations because Maldives is a coastal state and we do not allow distant water fishing nations fishing in the Maldives exclusive economic zone. So I'll talk from a regional perspective. So going back to Dr. Dare's presentation, I think most of the problems or most of the causes, the root causes about distant water fishing nations is colonialism and imperialism. I think if we go back and find the root causes, those are the main causes. For example, from the research that we published with myself and my supervisor, Dr. Megan Bailey, last year in Journal of Sustainability, we showed that the exclusive economic zone of France in the Indian Ocean is 9 times larger than the exclusive economic zone in their metropole. So imagine a distant water fishing nation, France, coming into the Indian Ocean has more rights, 9 times more rights than its European Union exclusive economic zone. So the matter of distant water fishing nation is complex, and it goes back to the roots of colonialism, and without finding a solution to colonialism and imperialism, it's very difficult for us to kind of resolve the issues that we face with sustainability and also the others as well. And then the second point that I would like to highlight is that from the research that Dr. Liam Campling has done on value chain and supply chains, we could see that these fishing nations and these fishing companies and fishing vessels have grown their fishing industry vertically and horizontally in the supply chain, meaning that they have expanded their fishing, as Dr. Dare mentioned, that to other coastal states. And also they've been mixed with the supply chain, with the processing industry, and also with the market. So coastal states who rely on the fisheries has to export to the same market as which the distant water fishing nations has real authority to. So the matter becomes really a huge complex issue. And then comes with, I mean, what happens to the people who are involved with it? I mean, the states that allow these fishing practices to happen. And Dr. Dare mentioned about the feelings of or the resilience that's been shown by African states, and Sheena mentioned about Seychelles. I think Dr. Miali has shown that in Western Indian Ocean, there's huge, anger towards distant water fishing nations because the fish is being taken away while these fishing vessels, these nations continue to fish. And then the real question is, I mean, under the Law of the Sea Convention, most of the developing nations only has got the rights to fish for the last 20 years, last 30 years. And they are right now only developing their fishery. The developing states are developing their fishery, while the developed has already developed their fisheries using taxpayers' dollars as harmful subsidies. So the question is right now, how, when there is overfishing, and most of for example, in the Indian Ocean, the yellowfin tuna is over-harvested, the skipjack tuna is almost harvested over the harvest control limit, the big eye tuna is harvested, overfished. So the question is, when all these developing states who are yet to develop their fishery, the developed already has taken most of the fish. So there's no room for the developing nations to develop at all. So it really concerns about equity, fairness as well. It connects to all those links. So it's really a complex issue. But thank you.
All right, we're starting to get some questions in. So I've got Angelo, Whit, and Pippa. I will go in that order. So Angelo asks about the definition of the separation that DYHIA used for 24 meters to separate between large and small. IUCN landed on greater than 12 meters as defining industrial fishing. So his question is, how do you think countries should define industrial or damaging fishing?
That is an excellent question that we have tried to answer on so many occasions, I would say, including with the FAO and the WTO as well. What I use is not a definition. Like that separation that I use is coastal and non-coastal, because 25 meters usually is, operating within the coast. But to be honest, I don't agree with the 12-meter definition. We had a lot of issues with WTO delegations with regards to that, because you will find a lot of vessels that are 12 meters or over, but that are, operating with 40 men on board or 40 fishermen on board and using rudimentary gear. I would not classify that as large scale. They're like, some pirogues are like 20 meters in length, and it's still a pirogue, and it's still fishing with really hand-drawn nets and these kind of things. So I wouldn't agree with that. I think that it goes much more than that. Where those vessels operate, whether they're using the dragged gear or not, these matter. I wouldn't be able to come up with a definition now. I tried. There is a paper that we have authored in 2016 that looks into the definition, but I wasn't myself satisfied with that definition, because there is always, a difference. I think each country has to have their own definition with regard to the cultural context within which their fisheries operate. We should not be seeking a global definition, because it's more harmful than beneficial. A vessel in Senegal that is 12 meters in length with rudimentary gear could be classified as industrial, while a vessel here that uses all the technologies that is like 10 meters in length is going to be classified as artisanal. And it's a bit dangerous, because it undermines these various contexts within which fisheries are. So I don't think that we should, and I did this, I was seeking a global definition, but I don't think that it's a great idea to do that. I think that we should stick with whatever a country calls as artisanal versus industrial, and they should have a logic behind that. While negotiating, for example, a WTO, they should say, this is why we're calling this sector artisanal because of this. This is our own definition. This is our own rationale. So I think that the length is a bit, it's oversimplifying the issue, to be honest. I don't think it's a great idea. We are really trying to move away from these colonial narratives of like trying to have one single uniform idea of things, and it shouldn't be the case right now. Countries should be able to have their own agency over their own definition of their fisheries, and that would be my answer to that.
All right, thank you. That was very well reasoned without being the single answer, and you backed that up. You backed that up very well. We have now more questions coming in on the Q&A. So Whit asks about the percentages of trafficked labor in the various fleets being very striking. So could you talk about those figures and the methodologies behind them? And he mentions a recent McDonald et al. Paper using Global Fishing Watch to predict the risk of labor abuses in distant water fishing. So what are your thoughts on tying this kind of predictive analysis to enforcement mechanisms, such as the Port State Measures Agreement?
Absolutely. So in terms of that number, 40% came from a report, I believe, that was cautioned by the Minderoo Foundation, where they looked into people operating within the fishing sector in Thailand, and a sample of people operating within the fishing sector in Thailand versus the ones that have been rescued a few years ago. And they found that 40%. It is not something that is global. It's really within the vicinity of that region of the world. We don't know globally how much that is. I do trust that methodology. I think it's even conservative, because not everyone comes up, not everyone is saved, not everyone speaks up. But it's still, it's very gloomy to think that 40% is already an underestimate. In terms of the Global Fishing Watch prediction algorithms. I have actually worked with Global Fishing Watch on some of those aspects. I help them a bit with data mining, and I do like the idea of almost profiling, if you will, of vessel activities being potentially. So if you have multiple baskets of crimes, human rights and labor abuses within one of them, and you can say whether there is a risk associated with the vessel, it really helps enforcement, move in and say, and talk to people. Maybe not enforcement always a good idea, but like there are different ways that you can help people speak out, make them feel that they are in a safe environment to be able to speak. I think that it's more helpful than harmful, because at the end of the day, we need to have an idea of how their typical operations look like. And it could really be helpful when vessels come in to port to know whether there's a risk associated with that particular vessel or not, based on this basket of crimes. So I do like that. I don't think that it's perfect right now. I think there's still a lot of work to do to perfect that type of algorithms. It might be missing, for example, aspects of decent work versus, human rights, labor abuses and things like that. But we're moving forward and in the positive direction, I think.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, happy to have all of these questions come in. So the next question from Pippa, which I will put to Sheena. What do you think are the major priorities to improve the overall sustainability of, whoa, so many questions are coming in. I've lost my questions. The sustainability fisheries partnership agreements between the EU and partner countries. Sheena.
I think that's such a good question. And I think one of the things is really, like, speaking from the Seychelles perspective, you can see that the capacity that we have within country to actually negotiate to the level that we have to is sometimes really difficult. And like Hussein said, it is extremely complicated. For example, last year and this year, we still rely heavily on tuna that comes in and goes into the canneries and those containers that would otherwise be empty to go out so that we can import stuff, so it is really, really complex. But I think one of the major things that we have is a real capacity when we are doing a lot of our negotiations. And not to mention the fact that a lot of the contracts that have been set up have been done in the past, a very long time ago, under different governments. How transparent that was in the past is another question we have to ask. And something that Hussein said that was really, really, really interesting, and I think really applies to places like Seychelles, is the fact that you might have put in place in the contract, okay, 20 years from now, we'll help you develop this industry, but by the time these distant fishing fleets leave, there is no more fish. So I think the work is actually multi-layered. There's a lot of work to be done, especially coming from a population that is so small. We rely on a lot of expertise from the outside, and that's something we spoke about yesterday when we spoke about parachute science. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. And the only way to have stronger agreements is to be able to put the pressure on EU countries, and that requires knowledge as well. So in short, it's very layered, and I think the work that we have to do requires a lot of knowledge and capacity building within Seychelles itself.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving along. I'm glad to get so many questions in, and happy to see so many participants join us. I'm very pleased. Okay, so the next question is from Rob, and I am going to put this to DYHIA. Does the work of environmental defenders, that the work they do with the Coast Guard authorities of West African countries, is that actually helping to decrease the volume of illegal distant water fishing in those waters? Does it work or no?
You want to get me in trouble, Rob? So I'm gonna be extremely blunt. I think that while I was a very big fan, I'm gonna put names where they belong. I think that the work of the Sea Shepherd, for example, is great when it comes to building capacity, when this capacity is lacking. But assuming that there is no capacity and just importing, if you will, this way of monitoring to the states really perpetuates the lack of capacity itself. In short, it helps when they are there, but the moment they leave, it doesn't deter the issue. It does not remove illegal fishing. And they have proven that. They wanted to prove something else. I'm not sure what. They have actually proven that in the Gambia, when they pretended as if they left, and the moment that the fleet and the industry heard that they left, they went back and started fishing illegally. And this is a great example showing that it's not a deterrent. We need solutions that are deterring the issue, not only stopping them on the spot. It does not help. It perpetuates this idea that states are incapable of addressing the issue. If we really want to help, we need to find decolonized solutions. We need to find the context, understand the context within which they operate, and find solutions that they have agency on, not importing solutions from elsewhere. I really like the work that the Canadian Coast Guard are doing when it comes to building capacity all over the place, because they truly built capacity. The MLAP operation in West Africa by the United States as well, I really like that. It really changed a few things. But importing a solution that leaves and then, the issue comes back, it does not reduce the issue. That's, I think that's as blunt as I could go without getting in trouble, but yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to kick the next question to Hussein. I think there's some written answer that's coming for Jonas. So this one is going to be from Saeed. Do you think migratory fish species maybe are more exposed to overfishing than other species? Are there any specific criteria for commercial species harvest for pelagic or demersal species?
Not really. I think any species that are fished, beyond their sustainable yield, maximum sustainable yield, is subject to overfishing, and highly migratory species are mostly fecund, so it reproduces significantly. But then the problem is that there is too much pressure on these fish stocks. But pelagic species as well is prone to it. For example, deep water shrimps and stuff has been overfished, and these are all fished illegally. For example, we've seen in the northern Indian Ocean, a very recent paper published showed that there was significant fishing pressure by illegal fishing harvesters, mostly from distant water fishing nations, because there is no regional fisheries management organization in that region. Especially above our Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Commission, there is a huge gap where there is no Fisheries Commission right now. There is a huge overfishing going on within those waters. So the solution is fisheries management, to be in short, yes.
All right, any further comments on that from Sheena or DYHIA before I move to the next question? All right, move to the next question. Kieran, do you think organizations working on these issues should be working with the authorities with distant water fleets like Europe, EU, and China to improve their practices, or countries affected by them, i.e. Senegal, Seychelles, to improve their agreements? And can anything be done on a more bottom-up level with small-scale fisheries to address these issues? And I'm going to riff on this question a little bit. I'm very curious about what the various perspectives are of small-scale fishers of the distant water fleets. Is it by its very nature adversarial? Do they think that that's the problem, and then all of the woes of those fisheries is because of distant water fishing? Yeah, like, what does that relationship really look like? I'll start with DYHIA, but I think this is a question for all three.
Yeah. So I'm going to say that there is only one way to improve the way these agreements, like, is it still here? The way, where is the question? I'm just looking for the question. Okay, I think there's only one way through which these agreements could be actually improved. Not having them anymore. This is if we're talking in certain context. Again, like, I'm not stereotyping every single one of these agreements. Sometimes they are necessary and needed, but most of the time the times they are not, especially when they are fought by the small scale sector in courts, you know. The EU agreements, we looked into this with IFE, and we called them duplicity of policy. You know, we tried to go for hypocrisy, but the editors were not very happy with that, so we went for duplicity. The reason behind that is that it's really hard in the developing states' waters to know the status, the stock status of a fishery to begin with. The second thing is that we have to make sure that there is a surplus, and this is by international law. We have to make sure that there is a surplus to be caught. In many cases, especially in the case of West Africa that is being mentioned here, in many cases, there is no such a surplus. You know, it's an idea that there is a surplus and hence they have to sell. In the case of Tanzania, I heard, you know, senior level policymakers and officials saying that they didn't have agency over their decision whether or not they agree to an agreement. You know, we have to sell our fish stocks. I actually heard this. So there is a problem first of if we want to really improve the thing. To me, some of these agreements should not even occur. They should not even exist. And when they should exist, or where they can exist, they should be, there is a level of transparency that has to occur since the beginning of the negotiations. There is never a level of regionalism that should occur as well, because if one state negotiates on their own, they're not going to be winners against, you know, the EU, for example, or China. There's a certain political power to it. There's a certain economic power to it, and a power imbalance, unfortunately. So I think that transparency, real, meaningful transparency, since the very beginning of the talks should happen, as opposed to, you know, like, this is the agreement, this is what we reached, and this is how much we're going to pay, which is usually like ridiculous amounts. So I think that first thing is, should these agreements occur? This is a very good question. Should we as the EU or China be fishing somewhere else? Naturally, many cases, the answer to that is going to be no. And when it is yes, transparency from the beginning to the end. And to chime in a bit with regards to small scale sector, I have never ever, like, and this is not a study that I have done, but I have never heard a small scale fisherman be happy about a decent water fishing fleet. It's usually quite the opposite. You know, there have been court cases, there have been protests, and this is not only in West Africa. There have been, you know, call outs by by whether in Canada, you know, East Africa, whether, you know, in Australia, New Zealand, etc., and West Africa. It's usually the same thing. They are not happy because of the levels of, you know, competition that exists. But in some contexts, for example, if you go to Ghana, some parts of the artisanal sector, like the psycho, which are very problematic, by the way, are going to be quite happy to have decent water fishing fleet within those waters. But that part is problematic to the actual traditional sector as well. So in simple, that's very adversarial. Yeah.
So I'm going to quickly allow Sheena or Hussein to make comments, and then we have one more question that hopefully we get to, and then we'll try to wrap up, and Arju will tell us about upcoming webinars.
I can chime in quickly, and I agree completely with Dr. Belhabib, but especially within Seychelles context. So artisanal fishermen work completely differently. Generally, they're very close to the coastal areas, whereas the bigger fleets are further away. But we do have a semi-industrial fishing fleet that are targeting tuna. So there is always some kind of conflict, but it's not as pronounced perhaps in the Seychelles as in many other areas. But one of the things that you did mention is the fact that there is power to these contracts. And again, transparency is really important when they exist, which if anyone has read the new FITI report from the Seychelles, there are quite a few of those contracts that, you know, we don't even understand what they are showing. So just on those 2 points, there is a lot of power when you're talking tuna. There's a lot of money involved as well. And as a small island state, it is very difficult to just negotiate that on your own, especially when it's a very small population.
Yeah, just to echo it, and then also it's not only the small scale fishermen of those countries that allow distant water fishing nations, but also it affects everyone around those states. For example, we talked about Seychelles allowing distant water fishing nations, but there are other states that are around Seychelles that do not do so, but are affected by the enormous amount of distant water fishing done in the Indian Ocean. So that also affects significantly on that. And to talk about power as well, one of the papers that we've developed that are in review shows that there is a huge money going on, and these fleets target countries with lower indices on rule of law and huge indices of corruption as well. So those are kind of soft targets for distant water fishing nations, and I hope to see it published very soon.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I definitely want to read that. And I think DYHIA made a comment about regionalism, and there's definitely two different ways that coastal states have approached this, because in the Pacific you've got the PNA, and in the Indian Ocean, the sort of different coastal states kind of do different things, and they don't caucus together in the way that PNA states do. And it's an interesting experiment to watch play out in these two different ocean basins. So I want to get to the last question. Do RFMOs have limited intervention capacity in distant water fishing in the Indian Ocean, where many coastal countries don't have distant water fleets? So this is a Hussein Sheena tag team answer. And we might have time for one more quick question if anybody still has one lingering question, and then we will close it out. So Hussein Sheena, go.
Yes, so in the Indian Ocean, there is a very small similar group like the PNA. There is a group called G16 like-minded coastal states who tries, which is at the infant stage right now, where they try to kind of group coastal states together in developing common positions when they go to the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. But then what really happens is it's just not the politics between, or the power grab that Dr. Dia mentioned really engulfs the whole discussions and the negotiations. Even though, for example, even if there is a common position, that common position gets quickly changed when there is influence, for example, from countries that provide foreign aid to those countries. For example, there are countries that significantly depend, that in particular least developing countries significantly depend on aid from these developed nations. So if there is a cap on aid, things change. I've seen it played out in La Reunion, for example. There was a coastal state that has already agreed to a measure, but then one of the ambassadors in that country met with the fisheries minister of the coastal state, and the decision was withdrawn. So that's the power grab by the distant water fishing nations, and that's the power that these distant water fishing nations have on coastal states. So it's not an easy task.
And yeah, I mean, Hussein has said it perfectly. The power imbalance is there, and it's present, and it's in your face, especially when it comes to distant water fishing. And how do you put restrictions on the same country that's giving you aid? So it's a very difficult task, but it's something that we have to face if we want a sustainable fishery to go on, really.
Well, that was, I think, probably a good note to end on, in that it leaves a challenge for the rest of us to figure out how transparency, how making your voices heard, how all of these things will influence or not some of these big challenges. So I am going to hand this over to Arju. I just want to thank all of the panelists and the questions and the folks that came and participated in this. And we're going to hear about more of these in the future. So take it away, Arju.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, DYHIA, particularly, and of course, Sheena and Hussein, for being with us today. I have already shared the information via chat box. Yeah, so if you have any topics you want to see as the future topic of webinars of SCB Marine, please feel free to reach out to us. We are not going to have any new webinars in June because there will be a flurry of activities around the World Ocean Week and World Oceans Day by all the big platforms, bigger than us, of course. Yeah, so, but we will continue with the webinars in July and probably in August also. So please reach out to us. I have shared my email in the chat box. If you want to share anything with us, just to conclude this webinar, DYHIA.
Oh, DYHIA, you get the last word.
I do. Well, thank you very much for having me, and just keep believing in transparency. That's, I don't know, I have to come up with something inspirational. Yeah, thank you everyone for having me.